On the morning of January 16, 1974, Wichita, Kansas, woke up as it always did, in the flat winter light of the southern Great Plains, the city spreading out across the convergence of the Arkansas and Little Arkansas rivers in the particular, unhurried way of a mid-sized American city that has always understood itself as a practical place, a place of industry and agriculture, and the specific civic ambition of a community that wants to be prosperous and safe and good. The temperature was in the 30s. The sky was gray. People went to work and to school and to the grocery store, and many of them passed the house at 83 North Edgemore Street without knowing that inside it, 4 members of a family named Otero had been murdered the previous afternoon, and that the man who had killed them was somewhere in the city, going about his business, and that he had enjoyed it, and that he was already thinking about who would be next. That morning was the beginning of 31 years of something that Wichita would never be able to name exactly, never be able to fully contain or explain. The knowledge, which came in waves and receded and came back, that there was someone among them who killed people, who had a name that was not known, and a face that was not known, and an address that was not known, who went to the grocery store and the gas station and the church like everyone else, who perhaps said good morning to people they knew, who had perhaps sat next to someone at a football game or stood behind someone in a checkout line, and who had also strangled children in their beds and sent letters to the newspapers describing what he had done and why, and who would not be found for 31 more years. He called himself BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. He gave himself the name in 1974, in a letter that was found in a library book, and the name was the fullest and most honest statement he ever made about who he was and what he did, stripped of all the other framings he would use across the decades, stripped of the poetry and the puzzles and the bureaucratic language he would eventually use to describe his crimes to the families of his victims at his sentencing hearing. Stripped down to its operational core, he bound people, and he tortured them, and he killed them. His actual name was Dennis Rader, and he was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, a small city in the southeastern corner of the state, the son of William Elvin Rader and Dorothea May Cook. He was the eldest of 4 boys, raised in a household that was, by any external measure, ordinary. A working-class family in a small city, Methodist in faith, conventional in its rhythms, not remarkable in any way that produced alarm. He was a Boy Scout. He hunted. He attended church. He did the things that boys in small Kansas cities in the late 1940s and the 1950s did, and he looked, from the outside, like what he was performing himself to be, which was an ordinary boy. Inside, he was not ordinary. He would say later, in the extensive communications he produced across his decades of killing and his eventual imprisonment, that the fantasies had been there from very early on, from before he could have given them a name or understood what they meant, dark and specific and detailed in a way that the mind of a child should not contain. He was drawn to violence in his imaginations. He was aroused in ways he would eventually describe with a frankness that was its own form of horror, by the idea of controlling and harming women, by the specific image of a woman bound and helpless and entirely at his disposal. He did not have a framework for these thoughts as a child. He had no one to tell them to, and no mechanism by which to seek help, even if he had wanted help, which there is no evidence he did. He had the thoughts, and he managed them, and they grew with him as he grew. He tortured animals. He hanged cats and dogs, as a child, in the barn and in the woods, near wherever the family was living, and the doing of it gave him something he could not get elsewhere, a relief from the pressure of the fantasies that was only temporary and that required repetition. He stole women's undergarments from clotheslines. He found and kept photographs and materials that served his fantasies in the way that his own imagination was never quite sufficient to serve them. He was building a private interior world that ran alongside his public exterior life, with no connection between them except the single person who inhabited both, the person who would eventually become a husband and a father and a church president and a serial killer. He moved to Wichita in 1966 after completing a degree at Kansas State University in Pittsburgh and before his enlistment in the United States Air Force. He served in the Air Force from 1966 to 1970, stationed at various bases, including Amarillo Air Force Base in Texas and bases in Asia, and the service produced in him neither the crisis nor the revelation that might have changed the direction of what he was becoming. He returned to Wichita in 1970 with the fantasies intact and with an improved capacity for planning and procedure, a clearer understanding of the organizational logic that he would eventually apply to his crimes, the methodical approach of a man who had learned to operate within institutional structures while maintaining his private world completely separate from the institutional one. He married Paula Dietz on May 22, 1971. She was a woman who would later describe her husband in the specifically devastating terms of someone who has been deceived completely, someone whose entire understanding of the life they lived has to be reconstructed from the foundation up when the truth is finally known. She knew Dennis Rader as her husband for 34 years before he was arrested. She knew him as the father of her 2 children. She knew him as a man who was involved in their church, who served in community roles, who was handy and capable, and a person of apparent standing in the small-town world of Park City, the suburb of Wichita, where they eventually settled. She divorced him shortly after his arrest, and the divorce is not a comfortable detail, but it is an honest one. She was as completely deceived as everyone else in his public life, perhaps more so, and the deception was total and sustained across more than 3 decades of daily proximity. Their children were Brian, born 1975, and Carrie, born 1978. Both of them grew up in the household of a man who was a serial killer and knew nothing about it until February 25, 2005. Both of them have had to remake their understanding of their entire childhood in the light of what their father actually was. Kerry Rader, who married and became Kerry Rawson, has spoken and written about this experience with a courage and a clarity that deserve recognition, and her story will be part of this account. But the beginning of the account is not with the family or the marriage or the children. The beginning is with the Otero family on the afternoon of January 15, 1974, which was the beginning of everything. Joseph Otero was 38 years old, a Puerto Rican-born veteran of the United States Air Force who had settled in Wichita with his wife and children after leaving the service. Shuli Otero was 34 years old, a woman who had met Joseph in the Air Force community and who had built a life with him in the specific way of military families who find a place and decide to stay, putting down roots in a neighborhood and a school district and a community that becomes theirs through the ordinary accumulation of daily life. They had 5 children, ranging in age from 14 to 9 years old. 3 of them were not home on January 15, 1974. Carmen, Charlie, and Danny. 2 of them were. Josephine Otero was 11 years old. Joseph James Otero, called Joey, was 9 years old. Dennis Rader, who was 28 years old and who had been planning this crime or something like it for years, drove to the neighborhood and watched the house. He had selected it. He had thought about it. He entered through the back door after cutting the phone lines, and he encountered not simply the adult couple he had perhaps specifically imagined, but also the 2 children who were home from school that day, and he proceeded with what he had come to do, despite the presence of the children, and this fact, this specific and monstrous fact, is perhaps the clearest single piece of evidence about the nature of what Dennis Rader actually was, beneath the scout leader and the compliance officer and the church president, beneath all the ordinary surfaces. He bound and killed Joseph Otero in the bedroom. He bound and killed Julie Otero. He killed Josephine Otero in the basement of the house. And he killed Joey. He was in the house for an extended period. He took a watch from Joseph Otero's wrist. He left. He went home, presumably, and went about his life. He went to work, or wherever he went on that January Tuesday. The Otero family was found when Carmem and Charlie and Danny came home from school and found the bodies of their parents and their younger siblings and called the police. Wichita had never experienced anything like this. The murder of an entire family in their home, in a residential neighborhood on the north side of the city, was not something for which the city had a framework or a response beyond the immediate shock of it, the specific disorientation of a community encountering violence of this scale and this apparent arbitrariness. There was no obvious motive. There was no obvious suspect. There was no sign of robbery. The family had been killed, systematically, and with a deliberateness that the investigators who processed the scene found both unmistakable and deeply troubling, in their own home on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The investigation began. It would continue, in various forms and with various levels of active intensity, for the next 31 years. Wichita in 1974 was a city of approximately 270,000 people, the largest city in Kansas, a place that described itself with some pride as the air capital of the world, the home of Cessna and Beechcraft, and the aerospace industry that had grown up there around the particular conditions of the Great Plains, the space and the light and the specific history of a region that had been making and flying aircraft since before the Second World War. It was a city with a university, with a medical community, with a downtown that had the specific character of Midwestern downtowns in the early 1970s, before the mall and the suburb had finished the transformation of American commercial life that they were then engaged in. It was a city of churches, Baptist and Methodist and Lutheran and Catholic, the full spectrum of American Christianity expressed in the specific density of a region that had always taken faith seriously as a social fact as much as a personal one. It was a city that had not, before January of 1974, been the kind of place where 4 people could be killed in their home on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon by a stranger who had no motive beyond the compulsion of his own pathology. It was about to become that kind of place, and to remain that kind of place for 3 more decades, and the specific quality of what it felt like to live in a city where BTK existed and could not be found, that quality of low-grade sustained dread, combined with the necessary practical requirement of continuing to live normally, is one of the defining features of the BTK case, and one of the things that makes it different in texture from most serial killer stories. Most serial killer stories are retrospective. They are told after the arrest, after the facts are known, in the specific past tense of events that have been resolved. The BTK story was lived in the present tense for 31 years by the people of Wichita and by the investigators who were trying to find him, and by the families of his victims who were trying to understand what had happened to their loved ones and why the person responsible had not been found. It was a story that the city lived inside, that was part of the texture of daily life in Wichita in a way that a resolved case never is, a presence rather than a history. Catherine Bright was 21 years old and a secretary who lived on the southeast side of Wichita on South Hydraulic Avenue. She was killed on April 4, 1974, less than 3 months after the Otero murders, when Rader entered her house and waited for her to return. Her brother Kevin was with her when she came home, and he survived despite being shot twice by Rader, who panicked when Kevin fought back and managed to escape and call for help. Catherine did not survive. She was strangled. Kevin Bright survived and became the only living witness to a BTK crime scene in the commission of a crime, and his accounts over the subsequent decades were part of the investigation's attempt to build a picture of the person they were looking for. In October of 1974, an anonymous caller directed BTK TV, a local television station, to a letter hidden in a book in the Wichita Public Library. The letter was addressed to the police and claimed responsibility for the Otero murders. It was the first formal communication from the person who would, in that letter and the subsequent communications that would follow across the next 30 years, call himself BTK. The letter described the Otero murders in specific detail, details that investigators confirmed were accurate and that could not have been known except by someone who had been in that house. It also introduced, in language that manages to be both bureaucratic and chilling, a self-description of what BTK was and what BTK did. He was not a random killer, the letter made clear. He selected his victims. He planned. He had what he called projects and factors and a specific operational logic that he applied to the selection and the approach and the disposal. He used the language of organization and process in a way that was itself a statement about how he understood what he was doing, not as violence or as crime, but as something more like work, a project to be undertaken and completed according to a method. He also said something in that first letter that would become one of the defining features of his subsequent communications across 3 decades. He needed the attention. He needed to be known, to be recognized, to be regarded as significant. The specific narcissism of BTK, the specific character of the exhibitionism that drove him to communicate repeatedly with police and media about his own murders across more than 30 years, is not incidental to the story of Dennis Rader. It is central to it. It is the mechanism by which he was eventually caught. It is the thing that most clearly distinguishes his psychology from the psychology of killers who stop and go silent, and who are therefore, from an investigative standpoint, in a much stronger position than he was. He could not stop talking about himself. He could not endure the obscurity of simply being a killer whom no one knew was a killer. He had to be seen. This quality, the compulsive need for recognition, sat alongside the violence and the calculation and the ordinary public life with the same impossible intimacy as everything else in Dennis Rader's dual existence. He was president of his church congregation. He was a dog catcher. He was a husband and a father. He was BTK. He needed the city of Wichita to know that BTK existed and to wonder about BTK and to be afraid of BTK, because in the wondering and the fear was the recognition that his public life, however successfully constructed, could not provide. 3 years of silence followed the Bright murder, during which Rader was living his public life and managing whatever private impulses required management, and then in March of 1977 he killed again. Shirley Vian was 24 years old and lived on North Hydraulic Avenue with her 3 children. Rader entered the house in the afternoon, when she was alone with the children, and locked the children in the bathroom so that they would not see what he was going to do. He strangled Shirley Vian. He left. The children, when they managed to get out of the bathroom, were alive. They had heard what happened to their mother. They were small children. They had to live with that. 9 months later, on December 8, 1977, Rader killed Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old secretary who lived on South Pershing Street. He had surveilled her neighborhood, had known her schedule, had entered her home when she was at work, and waited for her to return. After killing her, he used her phone to call the police from the scene, telling the dispatcher to send help to South Pershing Street, and then hanging up. He was already gone when police arrived. He called to report his own murder because calling to report his own murder was a way of asserting his presence, of demanding that the city respond, of making himself felt. he sent a letter after the Fox murder that contained a poem, "Oh, Death to Nancy," a piece of writing that reveals, in its grandiosity and its self-mythologizing and its complete absence of any recognition of Nancy Fox as a real person rather than as an element in his narrative, the precise nature of Dennis Rader's relationship to what he did. The victims in his communications were not people. They were cases. They were projects. They were evidence of his significance, props in the performance he was conducting for an audience of investigators and journalists and eventually the general public. The poems and the drawings and the letters and the packages were all aspects of the same underlying need, to be the center of attention, to be the subject of a story in which he was the most important character. This need, expressed over 30 years of communications, caused enormous suffering to the families of his victims, who had to read and hear about their loved ones, described in the language of BTK's self-mythology, who had to live in a world where the killer of the person they had loved was not only unknown, but was actively sending correspondence to newspapers and police, was actively demanding recognition and getting it. The specific cruelty of the communications is not only in what they describe, but in the fact of their existence, in the ongoing performance of power that they represent, in the way that each new letter or package or call was another assertion by Dennis Rader that he was in control, that the city and the investigators and the families of his victims were in his power, that he could do this indefinitely. But the road to the end was very long. After the Fox murder, Rader sent another letter to KTV, a longer communication that elaborated on his self-mythology and demonstrated something about his understanding of his own crimes that has been extensively analyzed by FBI profilers and forensic psychologists in the decades since. He believed he was controlled by a force he called Factor X, an internal compulsion that drove him toward violence and that he claimed he did not fully control. The Factor X explanation has been analyzed as both a genuine piece of his psychology, a real description of how he experienced the relationship between his impulses and his actions, and as a rhetorical strategy, a way of positioning himself as someone who was driven by forces beyond his control, rather than someone who made choices for which he was responsible. Both interpretations are probably partially correct. The compulsion was real. So was the choice. So was the enjoyment. In 1979, Rader sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper that included a poem he called "Death to Nancy," and that also included drawings he had made of bound female figures, the visual expression of the fantasies he had been managing since childhood, and that the murders and the communications were both expressions of. The drawings are, in their combination of specificity and crudeness, deeply disturbing, not because of their artistic quality, but because of what they reveal about the interior world that had been running alongside the ordinary world of Dennis Rader's daily life. This was what he thought about. These images were what he returned to, privately, in the management of his compulsions when he was not actively committing a crime. The investigation across these years was substantial and sustained. Wichita's police department dedicated significant resources. A task force was established. Tips were processed in the hundreds of thousands. Suspects were developed and investigated and cleared. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which was in this period developing the methodology that would become criminal profiling, provided assessments that were, in retrospect, partially accurate and partially limited by the specific state of the science in the late 1970s. The profile suggested a white male, 30 to 40 years old, a possible churchgoer, someone who worked in a position that gave him authority over others or access to their homes, someone with a history in the military or law enforcement. These characteristics were not wrong, but they were not specific enough to identify Dennis Rader from among the many men in Wichita who fit a portion of the profile, and the investigation could not narrow the field. He was quiet from 1979 until 1985, 6 years in which he was living his public life, in which he married and had children and worked various jobs and served in his church and managed, somehow, whatever the Factor X required for management. 6 years in which the investigation continued without new material to work from, in which the families of his victims lived with the specific suspended grief of people whose loved ones have been murdered by someone who has never been identified or caught. 6 years that were, for the city of Wichita, a period in which BTK was still a presence because no one knew whether BTK was finished or merely paused, and the specific quality of waiting in a city where a serial killer has been active and has gone silent, waiting to discover which category of silence this is one of the more psychologically particular experiences that the BTK case produced for the people who lived through it. In April of 1985, Maureen Hedge, who was 53 years old and who lived on North Independence Street in Park City, was killed by Dennis Rader. She was his neighbor. She lived on the same street. He had watched her and known her in the specific way of neighbors who acknowledge each other and who are in each other's peripheral vision as features of the daily landscape. He killed her in her home and then moved her body, a departure from his previous approach that reflected an evolving method and a confidence in his own capacity to manage evidence. He photographed himself with the bound body at a church location, using her as a prop in his fantasy photography. He buried her body, and it was recovered later. He also photographed himself in various poses at the location, dressed in female clothing, acting out the specific elements of the fantasy that had been driving him since childhood. The photographs were kept by Rader as records of his crimes and his fantasies, private documents of a private world, and they were found when investigators searched his home after his arrest, and they added a specific dimension to the understanding of what he was that the public record of the communications had not fully conveyed. Vicki Wegerle was 28 years old and lived on West 13th Street in Wichita. She was killed on September 16, 1986, when Rader came to her door, posing as a telephone company worker. She had a son at home, who was sleeping in another part of the house. Rader strangled her and took photographs of her that he kept. The photographs would eventually resurface in 2004 as part of his resumption of contact with authorities after 13 years of silence, sent as part of a package that confirmed BTK had committed the Wegerle murder that had not been officially attributed to him. Dolores Davis was 62 years old and lived on West 53rd Street South in Park City, the same suburb where Dennis Rader lived. She was killed on January 19, 1991, and her body was transported to a bridge where it was left under a concrete structure. She was the last of his 10 confirmed victims. After killing Dolores Davis, he went silent again, and this time the silence lasted 13 years. And in those 13 years, the world changed in ways that Dennis Rader had not anticipated, and that would eventually produce the specific mechanism of his downfall. In those 13 years, the internet was developed and deployed across American life. Digital forensics became a field. The specific traces that electronic documents leave behind, the metadata embedded in files, and the connection of digital media to the devices and institutions that produced them became legible to investigators in ways that were not possible in 1991. Dennis Rader did not fully understand what these changes meant for a person in his specific situation, and his failure to understand it is the reason he is in prison today. He resumed contact with authorities in March of 2004, 13 years after the Davis murder, when he sent a package to KSAS TV, a Fox affiliate in Wichita. Package contained a photocopy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license, which she had had in her purse at the time of her murder. It contained photographs of her. It contained documents that made clear, beyond any doubt, that the BTK who had been silent since 1991 was the same BTK who had been writing since 1974, and that the BTK who had killed Vicky Wegerle in 1986, which had not previously been officially confirmed as a BTK murder, was indeed him. The resumption of contact produced a specific, renewed crisis in Wichita. BTK was back, or BTK had simply never left and was now choosing to speak again. The investigation that had been continuing in a lower intensity mode across the years of silence was suddenly active again, suddenly receiving new material, suddenly in the position of having a correspondent who was actively and voluntarily providing information about crimes that had been unsolved for decades. The investigators handled the renewed contact with extreme care, understanding that the person sending these communications was both the source of information and the subject of the investigation, that the relationship being established through the correspondence was both an investigative resource and a window onto the psychology of someone who could not stop himself from reaching out. Between March of 2004 and January of 2005, Rader sent 11 packages and communications to various media organizations and to the Wichita Police Department. He sent cereal boxes containing photographs and documents. He sent padded envelopes. He sent letters. He was in correspondence with the city about his own murders with a regularity and a detail that, from the investigative standpoint, was remarkable, and from the psychological standpoint was a clear and sustained expression of the narcissism that had always been at the center of what he was. He needed this. He needed the attention and the response, and the knowledge that people were reading what he sent, that the city was engaged with him, that he was the subject of the story he had always needed to be the subject of. He asked a question that cost him everything. In January of 2005, he sent a communication that included a question for investigators. Could a floppy disk be traced back to someone? He was considering sending a floppy disk with documents on it, and he wanted to know whether doing so would expose him. The investigators, working with communication specialists and media professionals, crafted a public response stating that a floppy disk could not be traced back to a specific sender. The response was, in the specific terms of the technical question he had asked, essentially misleading. Floppy disks could carry metadata, documents created on computers and saved to disks, carried information about the software and the device and the user and the institution, and that information was embedded in the document, whether the creator knew it or not. He sent the disk. He sent a purple Memorex floppy disk containing a document he called the BTK story, a Word document that was a partly autobiographical account of his crimes and his history. The document contained metadata that placed its creation on a Dell computer. The document's properties showed that it had last been edited by someone identified in the system as Dennis. The metadata connected the disk to a specific institution, Christ Lutheran Church, in Park City, Kansas. Dennis Rader was the president of Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators had a name within days. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over in his vehicle near his home in Park City, Kansas, and was taken into custody without resistance. He was 59 years old. He had been killing, intermittently, for 31 years. He had been conducting a public correspondence with investigators and the media about his crimes for 30 years. He had been living an ordinary, public, recognized life in his community throughout, had been a husband and a father and a neighbor and a church president and a compliance officer and a dog catcher and all the other things that constituted his public self, and he had been doing these things in the same suburbs and neighborhoods and streets where he had killed people, sometimes literally on the same street. He was cooperative with investigators from the moment of his arrest. He confessed. He provided the detailed, organized, procedural account of his crimes, that his entire relationship to those crimes had always been organized and detailed and procedural, and he provided it with the same calm control that characterized everything he had ever done in both his private and his public lives. He told investigators where evidence could be found. He told them what had happened to victims who had not been officially connected to him. He provided, in short, what he had been providing in fragments across 30 years of correspondence, but now in the comprehensive form of a full confession, everything except regret. He did not appear to feel regret. This absence, which was noted by the investigators who worked with him in the post-arrest period and by the families of his victims who eventually had to sit in the same room with him during the sentencing hearing, is in some ways the most disturbing fact about Dennis Rader, more disturbing than the murders themselves in a specific and particular way. The murders are a category of horror that the human mind can place somewhere, can file under the heading of things that humans, at their worst and their most damaged, are capable of doing. The absence of regret suggests something that is harder to file, something about the specific nature of the person who was standing there, in the Park City suburb, in the Lutheran church, in the family home, being a person while simultaneously having done what he had done. The sentencing hearing was held in August of 2005. Dennis Rader stood before Judge Gregory Waller and before the families of his victims and before the assembled public and media of Wichita, and he gave an account of each of his 10 murders. He gave this account in the language that had always characterized his self-presentation, the language of projects and factors and cases, the bureaucratic language of a person who had organized his crimes according to the same organizing principles he applied to his professional life. He described the method. He described his actions toward each victim, using words that removed the humanity of the victim and retained only the operational dimension of what he had done to them. The families of the victims sat in that courtroom and listened to this account. They listened to a man describe killing their mothers and their siblings and their children in the language of process management, and they had no choice but to listen, because the law that had finally caught Dennis Rader also gave him the right to speak at his own sentencing, and he used that right in the specific way that his entire relationship to his crimes had always used everything, as an opportunity to assert himself, to be the center of attention, to perform his significance before an audience. Several family members were allowed to address the court. Steve Relford, whose mother Shirley Vian had been killed in 1977, spoke. Kevin Bright, who had survived the 1974 attack in which his sister Catherine was killed, spoke. The voices of the survivors and the families in that courtroom were the specific counterweight to the performance Dennis Rader was giving, the insistence of real human grief against the bureaucratic abstraction of his self-account, the reality of lives that had been ended and lives that had been permanently altered by what he had done, expressed in the specific terms of people who were living those alterations and who had been living them for decades. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, the maximum available under Kansas law. He was transferred to El Dorado Correctional Facility in El Dorado, Kansas, where he remains today. He was 79 years old as of early 2025. He will die in that prison. Kerry Rawson, Dennis Rader's daughter, was working in Detroit on the morning of February 25, 2005, when an FBI agent knocked on her door and told her that her father had been arrested for the BTK murders. She was 26 years old and had been living her adult life with no knowledge of what her father was, and the news the FBI agent brought her that morning required her to reconstruct everything she had thought she knew about herself and her family and her childhood. She has described the experience in terms that are honest about how total and how sustained that reconstruction has been, how the understanding of having been raised by a serial killer does not resolve itself into a stable new understanding, but continues to require work and thought and the specific kind of ongoing processing that does not have a neat conclusion. She has become a public advocate for victims' rights and for a more complete understanding of what the BTK case represents for the families of victims and for the families of perpetrators who did not know what their loved one was. She has worked with investigators and with researchers who are continuing to examine the question of whether Dennis Rader's 10 confirmed victims were in fact his total number of victims, or whether there are additional cases that have not yet been officially connected to him. This question is not merely academic. The investigators who have worked with Kerry Rawson and who have continued to examine Rader's history believe that there may be victims whose cases have never been officially connected to him. One specific case that has been the subject of sustained investigative attention is that of a 16-year-old girl who went missing in 1976. The specific details of this case and the specific evidence being examined by investigators working with the Rader connection remain under active investigation and have not been fully made public. What has been made public is the investigators' belief, informed by the patterns of his behavior and by specific evidence they have examined, that Rader's confirmed list of 10 victims may not be the complete list. This possibility that there are victims of Dennis Rader who have not yet been identified as his victims, who are in the files of other jurisdictions as unsolved cases or as missing persons with no resolution, is the specific haunting that the BTK case leaves behind. The 10 confirmed victims are known. Their families are known. The investigation is resolved in the sense that the perpetrator is convicted and imprisoned. But the possibility that additional victims exist, that additional families are waiting without knowing what they are waiting for, that the full scope of what Dennis Rader did across his years of killing has not yet been fully established, is a wound in the case that remains open. The 10 people who are confirmed as his victims deserve to be named here, in the order that their lives intersected with his, because they are the reason this story matters, and because their names are the specific and irreplaceable truth at the center of a case that has generated enormous volumes of discussion about the perpetrator. Joseph Otero, 38 years old. Julie Otero, 34 years old. Josephine Otero, 11 years old. Joseph James Otero, 9 years old. Catherine Bright, 21 years old. Shirley Vian, 24 years old. Nancy Fox, 25 years old. Maureen Hedge, 53 years old. Vicky Wegerle, 28 years old. Dolores Davis, 62 years old. They ranged in age from 9 to 62. They lived in the same city. They had no connection to each other except the specific and terrible fact that Dennis Rader had selected each of them, had decided that each of them would be a BTK project, had planned and approached and killed them, and then gone back to his public life as husband and father and community member and church president, and used them in the correspondence he sent to police and media as evidence of his significance and his power. They deserved to die of old age. They deserved the ordinary futures that Rader decided they would not have, and the specific quality of those denied futures, the specific content of what Joseph Jr. might have become if he had been 9 years old in a different house on January 15, 1974, or what Josephine might have done with the decades she was denied, or what Vicky Wegerle's son might have had of his mother if she had not answered the door on September 16, 1986, is the specific loss that the BTK case carries, and that no amount of forensic analysis or psychological profiling or criminal investigation can restore. Dennis Rader is alive. He is 79 years old, and he is serving 10 life sentences in a correctional facility in Kansas. And he has been described by people who have had contact with him in his imprisonment as still, fundamentally, the same person he was. Organized, controlled, self-referential, inclined to position himself as a subject of study rather than as a perpetrator of harm. He has sought to communicate about his case in ways that the prison system has largely prevented. He has attempted to maintain relevance in a world that has moved on from the specific terror he visited on Wichita across 3 decades. The specific quality of the life he is living, the ordinariness of the daily routine of a maximum security prison at 79, is in some ways the most complete available refutation of the self-mythology he spent 3 decades constructing. BTK was supposed to be significant. BTK was supposed to be remembered. And Dennis Rader is in fact remembered, but not in the way he intended to be remembered, not in the way the letters and poems and packages were designed to make him remembered. He is remembered as the man who killed Joseph, and Julie, and Josephine, and Joey, and Catherine and Shirley, and Nancy, and Maureen, and Vicky and Dolores, as the man who tormented their families and their city for 3 decades, and as the man who was caught because he could not stop talking about himself and could not understand that the technology of the world had moved past his ability to outwit it. He was caught by a metadata trail from a floppy disk sent to a television station. It is, in its own way, an ending appropriate to the specific vanity that had animated his entire criminal career. He exposed himself by the same compulsion for recognition that had driven him from the beginning, the same need to be seen that had led him to write the first letter in 1974, and that led him to ask, in 2005, whether a floppy disk could be traced, and then to send the disk anyway. The investigation is closed, in the sense that 10 victims have been accounted for, and the person responsible is convicted and imprisoned. It is not closed in the sense that all questions have been answered. The thin girl, 16 years old in 1976, is one of the open questions. The other possible victims, the cases that have been examined and that have not been definitively connected or definitively excluded, are the other open questions. Kerry Rawson and the investigators who work with her continue to examine these questions, continue to insist on the possibility that the full truth of what her father did has not yet been fully established. Wichita, Kansas, is a city that has spent more than half a century living with the BTK case in one form or another, first as a city with an unknown killer in its midst, then as a city that caught him, then as a city that processes its history with him, the way that cities process history with all the things that happened in them and that shaped them in ways they did not choose. The city has memorials for some of the victims. It has a history that includes this case as a defining event of the late 20th century, as the specific thing that Wichita is associated with in the national consciousness, in a way that it was not before January 15th, 1974. The morning of January 16th, 1974, when Wichita woke up and did not yet know what had happened in the house on North Edgemore Street, was the last morning of a certain kind of ordinary. The 31 years that followed were not ordinary. The morning of February 25, 2005, when Dennis Rader was pulled over in his vehicle and taken into custody, was the beginning of a different kind of ordinary, one that includes the knowledge that the person who killed those 10 people is in prison and has been confirmed and convicted and sentenced, but also the knowledge that the case contains a number of questions that have not been answered, that the full accounting of what Dennis Rader did across his years of killing may still not be complete. That incompleteness, that remaining darkness at the edge of a case that has otherwise been resolved, is the specific and haunting thing that the BTK story leaves behind. Not a mystery about who did it. That is known, but a mystery about the full extent of what was done, a mystery that lives in the files of cold cases and missing persons reports that have not yet been connected, that lives in the possibility of families who are waiting without knowing what they are waiting for, that lives in the question of a 16-year-old girl who went missing in 1976 and who may be part of the story that is officially considered closed. The names are the weight. Joseph, Julie, Josephine, Joey, Catherine, Shirley, Nancy, Marine, Vicky, Dolores. 10 people, 10 futures that ended too soon and in the worst possible circumstances. 10 families changed permanently by the choices of a man who thought of them as projects and who is still alive and still in Kansas and who has spent the decades since his arrest as he spent the decades before it, inside the specific interior world that has been his whole life, the world of fantasy and control and self-mythology that produced the BTK letters and the murders and the floppy disk and ultimately the prison cell. He will die in that cell. The 10 victims died in their homes and at a bridge and in places they did not choose, in the hands of a man who should never have had that power over them. That is the full and irreducible truth of the BTK case. Beneath all the investigation and the profiling and the communications analysis and the forensic metadata and the 31 years of searching, 10 people were killed, and their killer is still alive, and there may be others whose names have not yet been added to the list. The specific texture of Dennis Rader's public life across the years of his killing is worth dwelling on, because it is not simply an interesting biographical detail, but a fundamental element of the case's horror, the specific horror of a man who was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him in his community roles, genuinely present in those roles, genuinely competent, genuinely engaged. He was not performing normality from behind a mask, in the way that we sometimes imagine dangerous people perform, creating a surface with nothing behind it. He was, in some real and operational sense, the compliance officer and the church president and the neighbor and the father, even as he was also BTK. The two versions of himself were not in simple opposition. They existed together in the same person, and the coexistence of them is the specific thing that makes the case so difficult to process, because it removes the comfortable distinction between the monster and the man that most true crime narrative relies on. He was elected president of his Lutheran church congregation. This is a position that requires, among other things, the sustained confidence of the people in the community who know you, who vote for you, who see you in the specific intimacy of a religious community, where the social bonds are tighter than ordinary social bonds, where the person who leads the congregation is known not just professionally, but personally, in the context of shared faith and shared practice and shared experience of the life of the community over years. The people who voted for Dennis Rader as president of their church congregation did not vote for a mask. They voted for a person they knew and trusted. And they were not wrong about knowing him, in the specific sense that what they knew was real. He was that person. He was also BTK. The two were not contradictions in the way we want them to be contradictions. They were dimensions of the same human being. His work as a compliance officer and as an animal control officer provided him with a specific relationship to authority that has been analyzed extensively by investigators and psychologists who have worked with his case. The compliance officer role, which involved enforcing city ordinances relating to property maintenance and public nuisance, gave him the power to enter people's properties, to make official demands of residents, to assert the authority of the municipal government in the daily lives of the people he was responsible for. He was described by some residents of Park City as an aggressive and sometimes petty enforcer, someone who used the authority of his position to its fullest extent, and sometimes in ways that felt personally targeted. This description connects to the broader pattern of a person for whom control was a fundamental need, expressed in his crimes as the ultimate form of control, and in his professional life as the smallest available form. The dog catcher role, which is the description that has attached itself most persistently to Rader in public discussions of the case, also had a specific dimension that connects to his broader psychology. It put him in proximity to animals, to living creatures that were in his power, and there are accounts in the investigation of his treatment of animals in that role that are disturbing in the specific way that the treatment of animals by someone with his history is disturbing. He was also a hunter, as he had been since childhood, and the relationship between hunting and his crimes, between the legal and culturally sanctioned killing of animals and the profoundly illegal and morally catastrophic killing of people, is one of the threads in his psychology that researchers have examined without reaching fully satisfying conclusions. What the examination of his public roles does produce, clearly and consistently, is the picture of a man who needed to be significant, who needed to have authority, who needed to be the person who could make decisions that affected others, who needed to feel that his presence in a situation made a difference. This need expressed itself differently in different contexts, differently in the compliance officer role and the church president role and the BTK role, but it expressed itself consistently across all of them as the same underlying requirement. He needed to matter. He needed to be the center of something. He needed the recognition that the external world provided only imperfectly, and that his private world, the world of fantasy and correspondence, and the BTK identity, could provide without limit. The specific vanity of the BTK communications across 3 decades is, when examined closely, one of the most detailed self-portraits that any serial killer has ever produced, because the letters and the poems and the packages were not only accounts of crimes, but accounts of self, ongoing elaborations of how Dennis Rader understood Dennis Rader, what he thought of himself, what role he imagined himself playing in the story he was constructing through the murders and the correspondence together. He described himself as a phantom. He compared himself to Jack the Ripper. He sent drawings of himself in the role of the powerful, knowing predator, the figure who moves through the city unseen and invincible and choosing who will live and who will die. These self-descriptions were consumed by investigators and by the public and by the media across the years, and one of the specific things they produced, alongside the investigative value they occasionally provided, was a platform for the self-mythology, a stage for the performance that the correspondence itself was. Every time the Wichita Eagle ran a story about a new BTK letter, and every time KKTV broadcast about a new BTK communication, and every time the police task force held a press conference about BTK, Dennis Rader was receiving what he had demanded: attention, recognition, the confirmation that he was significant, that the city of Wichita was thinking about him and talking about him and trying to find him. The task force that was assembled to investigate BTK was, at its peak, one of the larger dedicated serial killer investigation units in American law enforcement. It consumed millions of dollars in resources across 3 decades. It processed hundreds of thousands of tips. It investigated and cleared multiple persons of interest, people whose misfortune was to fit some portion of the profile that investigators were working from, and who found themselves subjected to the attention of a major homicide investigation for reasons that had nothing to do with them. It produced, eventually, the arrest of the right person, but it produced it not through the patient accumulation of investigative intelligence, but through the specific and accidental mechanism of a technology-illiterate killer sending a floppy disk and not understanding what was on it. The investigators who worked the case across the 31 years have described the experience in various ways. The sustained frustration of a case that produced new material without producing the specific material that would identify the subject. The specific difficulty of working a case where the person you were looking for was actively communicating with you while managing the communications in ways that consistently prevented identification. The particular moral weight of knowing that the crimes were continuing while the investigation could not catch up with them. For the investigators who were working the case when it broke in 2005, who were present for the arrest and the confession and the sentencing, the resolution had a specific and complex quality. the satisfaction of the case being solved, combined with the weight of 31 years of what had not been solved in time. The BTK case has been extensively used in the training of law enforcement and forensic psychology students in the decades since the 2005 arrest, both as a case study in the specific operational methods of a long-active serial killer and as a case study in the psychological profile that the communications and the post-arrest confessions together produced. The profile that emerged from the post-arrest analysis was, in many respects, consistent with what the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit had predicted across the decades of active investigation, but the specific details, the church president and the compliance officer, and the specific relationship to control and authority, added dimensions to the profile that the pre-arrest analysis had not fully developed. The Behavioral Science Unit's analysis of BTK across the years of the investigation is itself a significant document in the history of criminal profiling, because the case provided an extended opportunity for the unit to test its methods against the actual communications and eventually against the actual person, to see which elements of the profile were accurate and which were not, to understand the specific ways in which the analytical framework both captured and missed elements of the truth. The result, for the field of criminal profiling, was a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between the observable behaviors of a serial killer and the specific person behind those behaviors, an understanding that has been incorporated into subsequent training and methodology. The specific element of the profile that was most accurately predicted and most consistently missed was the ordinariness of his public life. The profile accurately predicted many of the specific characteristics, the gender, the general age range, the likely church-going background, the likely relationship to authority, the likely presence in some kind of community role. What the profile did not fully predict was the degree to which those characteristics would be expressed not as a performance of normality over an interior of obvious dysfunction, but as a genuine, functional engagement with the community roles he occupied. The investigators who looked for BTK in the years of the investigation were, implicitly, looking for someone who was performing ordinariness without fully achieving it. Dennis Rader was fully achieving it, for decades, not by suppressing the other dimension of himself, but by maintaining the two dimensions in the specific compartmentalized way that his psychology allowed. The compartmentalization is perhaps the most discussed and least fully explained element of his psychology. How does a person kill 4 members of a family in their home on January 15, 1974, and then go home and continue being a husband and eventually a father and a church president and a community member, without any of those roles being contaminated by the awareness of the other, without any of the normal mechanisms of guilt and self-consciousness and social feedback that regulate ordinary human behavior, producing the kind of behavioral change that would be noticeable to the people around him? The question has been asked by psychologists and by investigators and by the people who knew him and by his own family, and the answer that has been offered, which is that his compartmentalization was both extreme and efficient, is an answer that explains the outcome without fully explaining the mechanism. What is clear is that the compartmentalization required effort, required management, required the specific discipline of a person who had spent his entire life maintaining 2 separate worlds and who had become very good at maintaining them. The discipline that he brought to the management of evidence, to the concealment of the specific objects and materials and records of his crimes that he kept in various locations, including a PVC pipe buried on his property, was the same discipline that he brought to the management of his dual existence. He organized the concealment of the evidence of his crimes. He organized the record-keeping that he maintained as part of his relationship to his own criminal history, the notes and the photographs and the documents that he kept as a private archive of what BTK had done. The archive was found when investigators searched his home after the arrest. It contained photographs and documents and objects that were, in their combination of specificity and meticulousness, a portrait of a man who treated his criminal history as a collection, who curated the record of his crimes in the same organized, classified way that he curated everything else in his organized, classified life. The archive included items taken from victims. It included photographs Rader had taken of himself, using victims' property, and in some cases, victims' bodies, as props in the continuation of the fantasy that had been running alongside his public life for decades. It included notes and drawings and the various textual records of his interior world that he had maintained as a private document of who he was when he was not performing his public self. The discovery of the archive was, for the investigators who processed it, one of the most practically significant and psychologically difficult elements of the post-arrest investigation. It confirmed the full scope of what he had done in ways that the correspondence and the confession had already largely established, but it did so in the specific form of physical objects, of actual items that had belonged to actual people who were now dead, and the confrontation with those objects as physical evidence of what had been done to real human beings was, by the accounts of those who worked with it, a particularly heavy form of the weight that this case had always carried. Kerry Rowson's experience of discovering who her father was, of having her childhood and her family history and her understanding of herself reconstructed overnight in February of 2005, is one of the most extensively documented examples in American true crime of what it means to be the child of a serial killer who did not know who their parent was. She has written about it. She has spoken about it publicly. She has become an advocate for people in comparable situations, for victims' rights more broadly, and for a more nuanced public understanding of the after-effects of violent crime on families that did not commit the crime, but are nonetheless transformed by its revelation. She has also, in recent years, become an active participant in the ongoing investigation into potential additional victims. She works with investigators who are examining cold cases that may be connected to her father, and she has spoken publicly about the possibility that the 10 confirmed victims are not the complete list, that there are cases that have not yet been officially connected to Dennis Rader that should be. The specific case of the 16-year-old girl who went missing in 1976, which has been the focus of ongoing investigative attention, is part of the reason that Rawson and the investigators she works with are insisting that the case is not fully closed, despite the arrest and conviction and imprisonment of the person responsible for the 10 confirmed murders. The specific investigative work around additional potential victims is being conducted with the awareness that the subject himself is still alive and is potentially available to provide information, but also with the awareness that Dennis Rader has demonstrated across his entire post-arrest engagement with investigators that he controls the information he provides according to his own calculations, that he is no more forthcoming about additional potential victims than BTK was forthcoming about his identity across 30 years of correspondence. He knows what he knows, and he discloses what he discloses, and the disclosure is managed in the same way everything else in his life has been managed, according to the specific internal logic of someone who needs to be significant and who has understood that information about his crimes is one of the last remaining sources of the significance he requires. The city of Wichita has processed the BTK case across the decades in the specific way that cities process things that happened in them that were not chosen and that cannot be undone. There is a BTK exhibit at the Kansas Law Enforcement Memorial in Topeka. There is extensive local historical documentation. The case is taught in criminology programs at Wichita State University. There are people in Wichita who were children during the years of the active murders and who are now in their 50s and 60s and who remember, specifically and personally, what it was like to grow up in a city where BTK was a presence, where parents gave their children specific instructions about doors and windows, and strangers that were shaped by the specific and local knowledge that an unknown killer was among them. The people who grew up in Wichita during the active years of the BTK crimes, and who are now old enough to articulate what that experience was, the specific texture of childhood in a city where there is a serial killer who cannot be found, have produced a body of testimony that is part of the broader record of what the case meant and what it did to the city. The testimony reflects, consistently, a specific quality of vigilance that was not paranoia, but was a rational response to the actual conditions of the time, a quality of heightened awareness of the environment and of other people that was produced by the knowledge that BTK was somewhere in the environment and that no one knew where. This is part of the specific harm the BTK correspondence caused that goes beyond the 10 murders themselves, the 30-year degradation of the quality of ordinary life in Wichita for the people who were aware of what BTK represented and who could not fully put it out of their minds. The families of the 10 victims lived with that awareness in its most acute form. The broader community of Wichita lived with it in a more diffuse but real form. The correspondence was not only a communication to police and media, but a communication to the entire city, a sustained assertion of presence and power that could not be fully set aside as long as BTK was unknown and uncaught. The resolution of the case in 2005 did not resolve this harm, because harm of this kind does not resolve when a conviction is entered. It changes form. It becomes the specific harm of a history that is known and documented and that is carried by the people who lived through it, in the formum racias, the specific ways that traumatic periods reshape the people who experience them. The families of the 10 victims have specific, particular, irreversible forms of this harm. The broader community has something less specific and less permanent, but nonetheless real. Wichita is a city that knows certain things about itself that it did not know before January 15, 1974, and the knowing of those things is a permanent feature of its self-understanding. Dennis Rader is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility. He is 79 years old. He has been in prison for 20 years. He will die there. The specific quality of the life he is living in the prison, the daily routine of an elderly man in maximum security confinement, is the closest available approximation to an accounting that can be provided for what he did, though it is, as accounting always is for crimes of this magnitude, fundamentally inadequate. The adequacy of the punishment for murder is a philosophical problem that has not been solved by any system of justice that has ever existed, and the BTK case does not solve it. What it does provide, or what it has provided across the 20 years since the arrest, is a body of knowledge about what Dennis Rader was and how he operated and what he did that is more comprehensive than what is available for most cases of comparable scale and duration. The communications themselves, 30 years of correspondence that laid out his methods and his psychology and his self-understanding in his own words, combined with the post-arrest confession and the ongoing engagement with researchers and investigators, have produced a record of unusual completeness. The record is disturbing, and the reading of it is disturbing, but it is also, for the researchers and the law enforcement professionals who study it, genuinely valuable, genuinely contributing to the understanding of a specific type of dangerous person and the specific type of threat such a person represents. Whether the knowledge is sufficient to prevent the next comparable case is the question that the BTK case, like all serial killer cases, ultimately poses to the systems of law enforcement and mental health and community oversight that failed to detect Dennis Rader across 31 years of active criminality. The answer, which is that no single case provides sufficient prevention, but that the accumulation of knowledge and the improvement of investigative tools provides better detection, is a partial and imperfect answer that reflects the partial and imperfect nature of all the systems that human beings build to protect themselves from the worst things that other human beings are capable of doing. The 10 people are the weight. They are the weight that the case carries and that no amount of investigation or analysis or institutional learning can lift. Joseph, 38. Julie, 34. Josephine, 11. Joey, 9. Catherine, 21. Shirley, 24. Nancy, 25. Marine, 53. Vicky, 28. Dolores, 62. The specific span of those lives, from 9 to 62, is a span that includes nearly the entire range of human adulthood and reaches into childhood. And the 10 people in that span had specific relationships and specific futures and specific things they were in the middle of when Dennis Rader decided they would be BTK projects. The specific thing that Joey Otero was in the middle of is what 9-year-old boys are in the middle of, the specific texture of childhood that includes school and friends, and the particular pleasures and concerns of a child who is old enough to have a life that is his own, and young enough that the life is still organized mostly by the people who love him, his parents. His siblings, the adults in his world who exist to protect him and who failed to protect him on January 15, 1974, not through any failure of their own, but because a stranger had decided that afternoon to enter the house. That is the BTK case, not the floppy disk, and not the task force, and not the criminal profile, and not the 31 years of investigation. The BTK case is 4 people in a house on January 15, 1974, and a stranger who came through the door, and 9 more people across 17 years, and the specific and irreversible harm that was done to each of them and to everyone who loved them, harm that continues in the form of lives shaped permanently by what was taken from them. Dennis Rader is in prison. He will die there. The 10 victims will not come back. There may be more. Carrie Rawson is still looking. The investigators who work with her are still looking. The case is officially closed, and it is not over. The specific quality of Wichita as a place, as the city that contained this history, is worth returning to, because the geography and the culture of the city are not simply the background of the case, but are part of its texture, part of what makes the 31 years of the BTK period different from what it would have been in a different kind of city. Wichita in 1974 was a city that understood itself as a community in a specific and somewhat old-fashioned sense, a place where people knew their neighbors, where the churches and the civic organizations and the neighborhoods were the social fabric that people lived inside, where the assumption of relative safety and relative trust was not naive, but was based on the actual experience of most people's actual lives. The BTK murders did not simply introduce fear into this community. They introduced a specific kind of suspicion, a specific quality of looking at the people around you differently, of wondering, because wondering was now rational in a way it had not been before. The geography of the killings, spread across the north and south sides of the city and into the suburb of Park City, meant that there was no single neighborhood that bore the concentrated weight of the murders, and no single neighborhood that could tell itself it was outside the radius of concern. The Otero home was on the north side. The Fox home was on the south side. Park City, where Hedge and Davis were killed, and where Rader himself lived, was a separate small city on the northern edge of the Wichita metro. The distribution of the crimes across the geography of the larger metropolitan area meant that the awareness of BTK was distributed across the city without geographic concentration, which meant that it was everywhere. The specific social context of the BTK period also includes the specific social context of American serial killer awareness in the 1970s and 1980s, which was very different from the social context of serial killer awareness today. The Ted Bundy case and the John Wayne Gacy case and the various other high-profile serial killer cases of the 1970s were producing, across American society in that period, a new and disturbing awareness of the category of serial killer as a specific and distinct type of dangerous person, different from the mass murderer and different from the conventional violent criminal, a person who killed repeatedly and over extended periods, and who was not easily identified by the conventional signals of criminal risk. Wichita was living through its own version of this emerging awareness in a form that was more immediate and more personal than the national conversation about serial killers, because Wichita's serial killer was not a national news story, but a local presence, not a name and a photograph on the front page of the newspaper, but an unnamed correspondent who was sending letters to that newspaper. The specific relationship between BTK and the Wichita media across 30 years of correspondence is one of the unusual elements of the case that distinguishes it from most comparable cases. Most serial killers do not conduct ongoing public correspondence with media organizations about their own crimes. Most serial killers operate in a relationship to the public that is one-directional, in which the public knows about them, but they do not know about the public's knowledge and do not seek to influence how they are understood. BTK's relationship to the Wichita media was interactive and sustained and deliberately managed by the person conducting it and the specific experience of the journalists and editors at the Wichita Eagle and at KK-TV and at KSAS TV who received and processed and made decisions about BTK communications across the years was one of the defining professional experiences of their careers. The ethical questions that the BTK communications posed to media organizations were genuinely difficult, whether to publish what BTK sent, knowing that publication gave him what he was seeking, the attention and the recognition, or whether not publishing would deprive investigators of the public assistance they were requesting, deprive potential witnesses of the specific information that might allow them to identify BTK, deprive the public of the specific knowledge they needed to protect themselves. These questions were argued, in various forms, across the 30 years of the correspondence, and the answers changed as the circumstances changed and as the understanding of BTK's psychology developed through the continuing analysis of the communications. The 2004 resumption of contact, after 13 years of silence, posed the media questions in a new and more acute form, because the 2004 communications were occurring in a different media environment than the 1974 communications. An environment that included the internet and that therefore included the specific dynamics of online discussion and social media that changed the way that information about ongoing criminal investigations was disseminated and processed and argued over. The specific communities of people who followed the BTK case online in 2004 and 2005, who discussed the communications and the investigation and the possible identities of BTK in real time across various web forums, were a new element in the case's public life that the investigators and the media organizations had to account for in their decisions about what to disclose publicly and what to withhold. The decision to publicly respond to Rader's question about whether a floppy disk could be traced, to state publicly that it could not, was made with an understanding of this new media environment, with an awareness that the response would be seen by a wider audience than simply the anonymous person sending the communications, and with a calculation that the specific investigative benefit of encouraging the submission of the floppy disk outweighed the risk that the response would be seen as misleading or manipulative if and when the full story became public. The calculation was correct, in the sense that it produced the specific outcome that allowed the arrest, and it was a calculation that required the specific combination of investigative judgment and institutional risk tolerance that the 31 years of working the case had produced in the people who made it. The Rader case has also been used extensively in the training of investigators in the specific challenges of managing a long-duration investigation, the specific ways that a case that has been active for years or decades creates its own institutional inertia and its own set of assumptions that can become obstacles to the specific insights required to break it. The investigators who worked the BTK case across the 31 years of its active duration were working in a context shaped by the previous year's work, by the theories and assumptions and investigative directions that had been developed and refined across the preceding years, and the specific challenge of maintaining openness to new directions and new information in that context is one that the case illustrates vividly. There were theories about BTK that proved wrong. There were suspects who were investigated intensively and who were cleared. There were leads that were pursued and that produced nothing. The specific false start that has received the most public attention is the early investigation of a man who was a local to the case's geography and who was subjected to extensive investigation before being definitively cleared. The experience of being a suspect in the BTK investigation, of having the full resources of a major law enforcement task force directed at you in the specific context of a case of this magnitude and public visibility, was itself a form of harm that the case produced in addition to the primary harm of the murders themselves. The BTK task force, across the years of its work, developed a specific institutional culture that has been described by some of the investigators who worked within it as one of the defining features of the investigation's long duration. The culture was one of sustained professional dedication to a case that was not producing the results that professional dedication normally produces. A culture that had to maintain its institutional energy and its organizational coherence across a period during which the case was making limited progress and during which the normal feedback mechanisms of investigative work, the results that confirm the approach and motivate the continued effort, were not being provided. The investigators who maintained their engagement with the case across the years of limited progress deserve recognition for that sustained engagement, even as the case's resolution ultimately depended on a factor that was not within their investigative control. The specific moment of Rader's arrest, on February 25, 2005, has been described by the investigators who participated in it as one of those moments in law enforcement work that simultaneously provides the specific satisfaction of the case being resolved and the specific weight of 31 years of what had not been resolved in time. He offered no resistance. He was cooperative from the first moments of his custody. He identified himself, he acknowledged who he was, and the specific quality of that cooperative identification, after 31 years of anonymous correspondence and 31 years of investigation that could not identify him, was itself a strange and specific experience for the investigators who had been part of the long search and who were now in the presence of the person they had been looking for. He was, in that moment and in the moments that followed, exactly what the investigators had been told by the behavioral science unit he would be: controlled, organized, in command of himself and his presentation, someone whose response to being caught was not emotional disruption, but the same measured management of his self-presentation that he had applied to everything else across his entire life. He talked. He was cooperative. He provided information. He did all of this with the specific demeanor of someone who had accepted that the game was over and who was now engaging with the new set of conditions in the same managed way he had engaged with every previous set of conditions. The confession he gave, and the manner in which he gave it, are part of the record that makes the Dennis Rader case so extensively analyzed in the criminological literature. He described each murder in detail. He used specific language that investigators have noted for its specific qualities: the avoidance of victim-centered language, the procedural framing of the acts, the specific bureaucratic vocabulary that had characterized the BTK correspondence and that characterized his post-arrest communications as well. He was not describing what he had done to real people in the language of real people. He was describing the execution of projects using the vocabulary of compliance and procedure. This linguistic dimension of his self-presentation has been analyzed by forensic linguists and by forensic psychologists as one of the clearest windows into his psychology, because language is the specific tool through which self-understanding is expressed, and his language, consistent across 30 years of correspondence, and through the post-arrest confession, and through the sentencing hearing, expresses a specific self-understanding in which the victims are not people but cases, in which the murders are not acts against persons but completions of procedures, in which the entire criminal history of BTK is a kind of work rather than a series of crimes against human beings. The sentencing hearing in August of 2005 was the moment at which this linguistic management of his crimes confronted directly the real human beings who had been most damaged by those crimes. The family members and survivors who spoke at the hearing, who addressed Dennis Rader directly, and who told him and the court what his crimes had taken from them, were speaking in a language that he appears not to have been capable of fully receiving, a language of loss and grief and specific human relationship that his framework did not have a category for. He had listened before, in 30 years of correspondence and in the months since his arrest, to people telling him what he had done and what it meant. He appeared to hear the words without receiving what the words were trying to convey. The families of the victims have continued to live with what was taken from them across the years since the arrest and sentencing. The specific form that the ongoing harm takes for each family is different, is shaped by the specific relationship to the specific victim, and by the specific circumstances of each killing, and by the specific subsequent history of each family member's life. Carmen Otero, who was 14 in 1974, and who found her family's bodies when she came home from school that January day, has spoken publicly about what her life has been shaped by. Kevin Bright, who survived the 1974 attack, has spoken publicly about what surviving that attack meant for his subsequent decades. The families of Shirley Vian, whose 3 children were locked in a bathroom while their mother was being killed, have spoken about what became of those children and what their lives were shaped by. These accounts, taken together, constitute a document of the full human cost of the BTK crimes that is more complete than any forensic report or criminal profile or investigative account, because it is a document about what the crimes did to real lives across the decades that followed, about the specific and lasting harm that an act of violence inflicts on the people who survive it, in every sense, including the people who were not present, but who were connected to the victims in ways that the crime permanently altered. The documentation of that harm is part of what Kerry Rawson's public advocacy represents, because she insists on the ongoing reality of that harm in contexts where the public discussion of the case is sometimes more focused on the psychology of the perpetrator than on the lives that were damaged by what he did. Dennis Rader, at 79 years old in El Dorado Correctional Facility, is in a position that no number of years in maximum security confinement can make fully comprehensible as an accounting for what he did. He is alive. The 10 people he killed are not. He is, by the accounts of those who have contact with him in the prison context, still engaged with his own significance, still the person who needs to be the center of something, who needs to be the subject of interest and inquiry, who has managed, even in confinement, to maintain some version of the role he always needed to play. The specific institutional role available to a convicted serial killer who is approaching 80 years old in a maximum security prison is a diminished one, but it is the role available to him, and he occupies it with the same calculation he has always brought to the management of his place in the available context. He will be remembered. That is the truth of the BTK case that is hardest to hold without discomfort. The case is famous. The BTK story is part of the American cultural vocabulary around serial killers. He is, in the specific and terrible sense in which the narcissism of his correspondence always intended him to be, significant. The specific significance is not the significance he sought, is not the mysterious and powerful figure of BTK who moves through Wichita undetected, is instead the significance of a convicted murderer and a case study in a specific type of pathology. But it is significance, and he knew that infamy was a possible form of the recognition he required, and he would not have been unhappy, probably, to know that his name is still being spoken 20 years after his arrest. The names that should be spoken alongside his, every time his is spoken, are the names of the 10 people he killed, and the name of his daughter, who has had to carry what he was, and the names of Kevin Bright, who survived, and the names of the children of Shirley Vian, who were locked in a bathroom, and the names of all the other people whose lives were shaped by what Dennis Rader did across 31 years of killing and correspondence. Those names are the weight the case carries and should carry. The rest is context. Joseph, Julie, Josephine, Joey, Catherine, Shirley, Nancy, Marine, Vicky, Dolores. 10 people. The rest of it matters because they mattered first.